Good evening. Get comfortable because tonight we're going to gently take apart a holiday you have celebrated your entire life without ever really questioning it. Picture it. A backyard. Smoke curling up from a grill that's been going since noon. Someone's cooler is full of drinks slowly turning into lukewarm soup. A folding table sags under potato salad nobody quite remembers who brought. And later, once the sky goes dark, a chorus of pops and whistles and booms rolls across every neighborhood in the country, because apparently the correct way to honor a 250-year-old piece of paper is to set off small, legally questionable explosives purchased from a man standing outside a plywood shed on the side of the highway. This is the 4th of July. You know it. You've always known it. It is stitched into the rhythm of every American summer, as familiar and unquestioned as the smell of sunscreen or the sound of a lawnmower 2 yards over. And here's the thing you're about to discover tonight, slowly, gently, the way a blanket settles over you when you finally stop fighting sleep. Almost none of what you think you know about this day happened the way you think it happened. Wrong date, wrong bell, wrong signing, wrong flag story, a song that has nothing to do with any of it. A building that didn't even have its famous name yet. History, it turns out, is a lot less like a monument and a lot more like a rumor that's been polished so many times it started to shine like fact. Before we sink into it, if you're the kind of person who likes to drift off to a voice untangling old myths in the dark, consider tapping that subscribe button, only if it actually earns a place in your nightly routine, not because I'm asking twice. And to whoever suggested this topic in the comments a few weeks back, thank you. Genuinely. This channel exists because of suggestions like yours, and I read every single one, even at 3 in the morning when I probably shouldn't be awake either. We're also on Spotify now, so if tonight you'd rather just close your eyes completely and let the voice carry you without a screen at all, there's a link waiting for you below now. Turn the lights down low. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background if you have one. That soft mechanical whisper does wonders for a tired mind. And let's slip backward together into the sticky, mosquito-bitten summer of 1776, where absolutely nothing happened the way your third-grade classroom poster suggested. The day everyone got wrong. Let's start with the crack running straight through the foundation of the entire holiday. The actual vote for independence did not happen on the 4th of July. It happened 2 days earlier, on July 2nd. That was the real moment. That was when a room full of terrified, sweating men in Philadelphia formally agreed to sever the colonies from the most powerful empire on the planet. The 4th was something else entirely. The day they finished polishing the wording of the announcement that would explain what they'd already done. So every single year, the fireworks go off in honor of a decision that had already been made and settled 2 full days before. It's a bit like throwing an anniversary party on the day the wedding invitations went to the printer, rather than the day you actually said, I do. Try to sit inside that moment for a second. It's July 2nd. The Pennsylvania air is thick enough that you could wring it out like a wet towel. Inside a crowded brick room, a group of exhausted delegates has just done the single most dangerous thing any of them will ever do in their lives. They've voted, formally and irreversibly, to commit treason against the British Crown. If there was ever a moment worth marking with noise and light and disbelief, this was it. And what did history do with that moment? It quietly filed it away and threw the party 2 days later instead. It's not really anyone's fault, though. What happened on the 4th was that Congress approved the final written text of the Declaration, the polished version, the one meant to be read aloud and printed and shipped out into the world. And because that document has July 4, 1776, printed proudly across the top of it, that's the date that stuck. People didn't remember the vote. They remembered the paperwork. The announcement became more memorable than the decision it was announcing. A bit like how a couple's wedding photos end up defining the marriage in everyone's memory, while the actual dry, unglamorous trip to the courthouse to file the license gets completely forgotten. John Adams, who sat through every exhausting minute of it, was completely convinced that July 2nd was the date history would remember. He was so sure of it, in fact, that he wrote it down in a letter, predicting that future Americans would celebrate that day for generations with bonfires, parades, and fireworks. He got almost everything right except, ironically, the one detail he was most confident about. Think about how strange this is when you translate it into modern terms. Imagine a company makes a massive, company-altering decision on a Tuesday afternoon. Everyone in the room knows it's real, knows it's final, knows life will be different from this point forward. But the actual public announcement, the press release, the all-hands email doesn't go out until Thursday because that's simply when the wording got finalized. And forever after, the whole company remembers Thursday as the day everything changed, while Tuesday quietly evaporates from the story. That's July 2nd, overshadowed by its own paperwork. None of this makes the holiday wrong exactly. The vote and the document are two halves of the same act, like deciding to jump and then actually jumping. We simply ended up commemorating the moment we announced the leap, rather than the moment we committed to it. So as you drift a little deeper tonight, hold this gently. The freedom you associate with one particular summer evening was actually locked into place 48 hours earlier, by a room of nervous men who had no idea which date the country would eventually choose to remember them by. Adams and the prediction he almost got right. John Adams deserves a proper introduction here, because he is, in a strange way, the founding father who accidentally became the patron saint of being slightly, infuriatingly correct. In a letter to his wife Abigail, written in the days right after the vote, Adams predicted with startling confidence that July 2nd would be remembered forever, celebrated with parades, bonfires, games, and what he called illuminations, which was simply the 18th century way of saying fireworks. He wasn't hedging. He wasn't saying sometime in early July, give or take. He named the day. He described the celebration in loving detail. And he was right about absolutely everything, except the one number in the sentence. There's something almost tender about how specific he was. He imagined the bonfires. He imagined the noise. He imagined an entire nation, generations into the future, making a joyful racket in his honor. And then history looked at his beautifully accurate forecast and quietly rescheduled the whole event 2 days later without telling him. Picture the modern version of this kind of miscalculation. You tell your partner, with total confidence, that this coming Friday will go down as the best night of your relationship. You describe the whole evening in advance, the restaurant, the music, the walk afterward. And then it all happens exactly as you predicted, beautifully, joyfully, except it happens on Sunday. You called every detail correctly except the one you were most sure of. That was Adams's entire relationship with this holiday for the rest of his life. He lived another 50 years after writing that letter, which gave him 5 full decades to watch his fellow Americans celebrate on the wrong day while he stood slightly to the side, arms crossed, quietly insisting they'd gotten the date wrong. He was, in effect, the original guy at the party gently correcting everyone, the kind of person you almost certainly know, and if you're being honest with yourself in the dark right now, the kind of person you might occasionally be. But there's something worth admiring underneath the mild comedy of it. Adams understood, better than almost anyone in that room, that this moment deserved to be remembered with noise and joy and a slightly reckless amount of gunpowder. He simply assumed the nation would remember the substance of what happened rather than the headline announcing it. He bet on the decision. The country bet on the paperwork. And as usual, the paperwork won. So the next time somebody at a party smugly corrects a tiny, mostly irrelevant fact while everyone else is simply having a good time, spare a thought for John Adams, a man who predicted his country's future with remarkable precision and still lost the argument to a document with better formatting. This script is nowhere near finished. We still have the truth about the signing, the bell, the flag, the anthem, and a genuinely eerie coincidence involving 2 presidents still ahead of us tonight. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breathing slow. We're still deep in the summer of 1776, and there's a lot more of this comfortable old story left to gently take apart. The signing that wasn't, you almost certainly picture it this way. A room full of founding fathers gathered around a long wooden table on the 4th of July, quill pens scratching, sunlight pouring through tall windows, each man solemnly adding his name to the parchment in one unified, heroic moment. That did not happen. On the 4th, Congress approved the wording of the document. That's it. That was the entire event. Most of the men whose names you associate with that day didn't actually sign anything until August 2nd, nearly a full month later. The dramatic group signing you picture in your mind is less a historical record and more a very convincing oil painting that got into everyone's imagination and never left. Let that sit for a moment. The single most iconic act of the American founding, 56 men risking their lives by putting their names on a document that legally marked them as traitors to the crown, did not happen on the day you set off fireworks for. It happened weeks later on an ordinary Friday in August in a room that nobody bothered to paint. What actually happened on the 4th was procedural, and if we're honest, a little dull. Congress agreed the wording was final. There was no ceremonial lineup. No golden light falling dramatically across a quill. Mostly there was exhaustion, relief, and an urgent scramble to get the thing printed and distributed before the whole plan collapsed or got them all arrested. The real signing, pen actually touching parchment, came once a formal, carefully handwritten copy had been prepared. Beginning August 2nd, delegates who happened to be in Philadelphia started adding their names. And even then, it wasn't all at once. It was a slow trickle. Men stopped by when they could, whenever their schedules allowed, over a period of weeks. Think about what this does to the tidy picture in your head, the one with everyone shoulder to shoulder in a single defining instant. It's a beautiful image. It's also, historically speaking, closer to a dramatization than a record. The truth is closer to a shared document that people signed as they found time for it, which anyone who's ever tried to collect signatures from busy coworkers will recognize immediately. Here's a modern comparison that stings a little. Imagine your entire team makes a massive decision in a meeting on a Monday. Everyone agrees. It's real, it's final, it's locked in. But the actual contract doesn't get signed until weeks later, and even then people sign it one at a time, whenever they happen to wander past the front desk. Nobody frames that. Nobody paints a mural of it. And yet that is essentially how the founding document of an entire nation gathered its signatures. None of this makes the men any less courageous. Signing your name to a document accusing you of treason is a staggering act of nerve no matter which Friday you choose to do it on. The point is only that the crisp, cinematic version, sunlight, unity, one perfect golden afternoon, is a story that got told afterward because it felt right. The reality was slower, messier, and spread out across a calendar the way real decisions usually are. A signing even messier than you'd guess. Even that August signing wasn't the tidy, dignified event you might now be picturing instead. Delegates wandered in over a stretch of weeks, some considerably later than August 2nd, whenever business or travel finally brought them back through Philadelphia. It was less a solemn ceremony and more a document quietly sitting in a room, waiting for people to notice it and pick up a pen. Here's a genuinely odd wrinkle in the story. A few of the men whose signatures appear on the Declaration were not even present for the actual vote for independence. They arrived in Congress afterward, joined the ongoing business of the war effort, and still ended up adding their names to the parchment, cementing themselves in history for a moment they hadn't technically witnessed. It's a bit like joining a group project in its final week and still being listed forever as a founding contributor. Meanwhile, at least one delegate who was there, who voted enthusiastically for independence in the room where it happened, never got his signature onto the famous copy at all, for reasons of timing and circumstance that have mostly been lost to history. So the list of signers isn't a clean snapshot of who actually made the decision. It's a slightly uneven record of who happened to be available, pen in hand, during a rather elastic window of weeks. Picture the modern equivalent. A company makes a huge decision. And to mark the occasion, someone prepares a nice certificate for everyone involved to sign. But people are busy. It sits on a desk. One person signs it 3 weeks late. Someone who joined the team after the decision was made signs it anyway, because he happened to be standing there. And the one person who argued loudest and hardest for the whole idea somehow never gets around to signing it at all, and spends the rest of his career mildly annoyed about it. That is roughly the true texture of the actual signing, not a single thunderclap of unified courage, but a long, quiet, almost administrative process carried out under the constant shadow of real personal danger. Every signature, whenever it was added, however late, was still an act of extraordinary bravery. These men were writing their names on a document that legally named them enemies of the crown. It's just that history prefers the clean version, the single moment, the shared breath, the unified act over the slower, more human truth of men committing treason calmly, deliberately, one Tuesday afternoon at a time. The famous painting that shows the wrong moment entirely, and then there's the painting. You know, the one reproduced in every textbook, printed on the back of the $2 bill, hanging in classrooms across the country. A dignified room. Founders arranged in solemn little clusters. A small group standing at the front, presenting something to the assembled Congress. Most people glance at it and assume it depicts the signing of the Declaration. It doesn't. It shows the drafting committee, the 5 men tasked with actually writing the document, presenting their draft to Congress for the very first time. That's it. Nobody in that painting is signing anything. They are turning in an assignment. The most famous image of American independence, reproduced endlessly for 2 centuries, is technically a picture of a group of men handing in their homework. The artist who created it, painting decades after the events it depicts, wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He was capturing a genuinely important moment in the process. But the scene looked so formal, so weighty, so obviously historic, that generations of people glanced at it and simply assumed it must be the signing. And once that assumption took hold, it never let go. The image became shorthand for something it doesn't actually show, a bit like assuming a photograph of someone holding up a trophy must be the exact moment they won it, when really they're just posing for the newspaper afterward. Consider the layers of irony stacked up here. The most recognizable image of American independence, printed on currency and hung in classrooms, depicts a committee submitting a rough first draft that was about to be aggressively edited by a room full of critics. It isn't the triumph. It's the nervous moment right before the triumph, the instant the authors handed over their work and everyone else got ready to tear into it. The modern version of this is almost too perfect to invent. Imagine the most famous photograph from your company's history. Everyone treats it as the great celebratory image, the big win, the moment of glory. And then someone points out that it's actually a photo from the meeting where leadership decided to cut a quarter of the original proposal. Suddenly, the heroic photo becomes something far more relatable and considerably more stressful. And yet the painting endures precisely because it feels correct. It has the right mood, the right gravity, the right sense of occasion. It simply happens to be capturing the wrong occasion entirely. This is a theme you'll notice returning again and again tonight. The version of the founding we carry in our heads is the emotionally satisfying one, not the literally accurate one. We remember the feeling and quietly discard the facts underneath it. So the next time you glimpse that scene on a $2 bill or a classroom wall, enjoy it for what it truly is, not the signing, not the final triumph, but a handful of exhausted, brilliant, deeply nervous men handing in a rough draft to a committee that was about to mark it up in red ink. Which brings us, quite naturally, to the man who wrote that draft and had to sit there quietly while everyone else took it apart. Still plenty of night left, and plenty of history still to unravel. Jefferson's quietly wounded pride, the quarter of his draft that got cut, and the deeply uncomfortable truth about what exactly was removed are all still ahead. Settle back in. Let your eyes stay soft, unfocused, half-closed if they aren't already. We're still in that same sweltering Philadelphia summer, and there's a quieter, more complicated part of the story waiting for us just ahead. Jefferson, and the agony of being edited. Thomas Jefferson gets the credit, and he earned a real share of it. He was the one who sat hunched over a small portable writing desk in a rented room, sweating through a Philadelphia June, producing the words that would eventually become the Declaration. That part is true, and it matters. But the popular image of Jefferson as a lone genius, single-handedly channeling the spirit of a nation through one inspired pen, needs a little air let out of it. He wasn't working alone. He was one of 5 men appointed to a drafting committee, a group that also included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, both of whom, as you might imagine, had opinions. Jefferson was chosen to write the actual draft partly because the others were busy with other matters, and partly because he had a reputation as a genuinely gifted writer. He was, in a sense, the guy the group project got assigned to. And then came the part every writer quietly dreads. Once Jefferson finished his draft, it didn't rise up as some untouchable, perfect text. It went first to the committee, and then to the full Congress, where dozens of men proceeded to do exactly what dozens of men with strong opinions and plenty of time always do to a piece of writing. They picked at word choices. They removed entire passages. They softened lines they found too sharp. They debated phrasing with the enthusiasm of people who have never once doubted their own taste. By most accounts, Jefferson hated every minute of it. He sat through the process seething quietly, watching sentences he'd carefully built get sanded down and rearranged by committee. For a writer, this is a very specific and very familiar kind of agony, not the sharp pain of outright rejection, but the slower, more maddening ache of watching other people alter your work in real time while you sit there, powerless to stop them. It's the feeling of watching someone walk into your home and calmly move all the furniture 6 inches to the left. If you've ever submitted something you cared about, a report, a proposal, a carefully worded message, and then watched a group of people revise it live in front of you, you already know exactly how Jefferson felt in that room. There is nothing quite like defending a sentence you love to an audience that has already decided it's cutting it. The honest truth, though, is that the editing probably helped. Historians generally agree the final version was tighter and more powerful than Jefferson's original draft. The committee structure meant the document became less the voice of one man and more the distilled expression of a shared, urgent cause. Jefferson supplied the soaring language. The room supplied the ruthless trimming. Between the two, they produced something stronger than either could have managed alone, which is, frustratingly, how a great deal of good work actually gets made, however much the original author might want to lie face down on the floor about it in the moment. So yes, Jefferson wrote it. But he wrote it inside a machine of collaboration and critique that shaped nearly every line of the final result. And the most painful cut of all, the one that still echoes across the centuries, is where we need to go next. The quarter that got cut, and the passage that mattered most. Congress removed roughly a quarter of Jefferson's original draft before giving it final approval. That is not a light edit. That is not a few tweaks for clarity. That is a substantial portion of a man's carefully constructed argument, lifted out and set aside while he sat in the room and watched it happen. If you've ever had a piece of writing trimmed by even a fraction of that amount and felt the sting of it, try to imagine losing a full quarter of it, in public, in front of your peers. The cuts weren't random. The delegates had real political reasons behind nearly everything they removed or softened. They were trying to produce a document that 13 wildly different colonies, with 13 different sets of interests, could actually agree to stand behind. That meant sanding away anything too sharp, too risky, or too likely to fracture a fragile and hard-won consensus. Every deletion was, in its own way, a small negotiation. Every softened phrase kept somebody somewhere on board. Jefferson, by most accounts, did not experience it as diplomacy. He experienced it as something closer to vandalism. He kept his own copy of the unedited original and made sure people could later see exactly what had been changed, which is, in 18th century terms, the equivalent of keeping the receipts and showing them to anyone willing to look. And in the middle of all this cutting, Benjamin Franklin, sitting beside a visibly wounded Jefferson, apparently did something quietly kind. He leaned over and told him a long, meandering, gentle little story, comfort disguised as an anecdote, designed simply to distract a suffering young writer from watching his work get taken apart piece by piece. There is something deeply human in that image. One of history's great statesmen, quietly running interference on a colleague's wounded pride, the same way a good coworker might pull you aside during a rough meeting and murmur that it's going to be fine, that you shouldn't read the comments. Here, though, we need to slow down, and I want to be honest with you rather than clever, because what comes next in this story is not something to soften with a joke. Among the passages Congress removed was a lengthy section in which Jefferson, a man who enslaved other human beings himself, condemned the transatlantic slave trade, placing the blame for it at the feet of the British king. It was one of the most forceful sections he had written, and it was struck out entirely before the document was ever approved, in order to keep certain colonies whose economies depended on slavery from rejecting the document altogether. This is one of the deepest, most uncomfortable contradictions sitting at the very center of the American founding, and it deserves to be looked at plainly rather than explained away. Jefferson wrote words condemning a practice he personally profited from. Congress then removed even that imperfect, self-serving reckoning, in order to preserve unity among men who had no intention of giving up the practice at all. Consensus, in this instance, was purchased at the direct cost of confronting the single greatest moral failure of the era. What makes this even heavier is what survived the editing process and what didn't. The phrase declaring that all men are created equal stayed in the final document. The passage grappling, however imperfectly, with the enslavement of human beings was cut. The founding text went on to proclaim a universal ideal, while the one section that acknowledged its most glaring violation was quietly set aside. This isn't a detail that fits comfortably next to fireworks and potato salad, and it shouldn't be made to. The people this affected were real, and the consequences of that particular editorial choice echoed through generations of lives that followed. A decision made in a warm room in 1776 reflected, in a very real sense, a nation choosing unity over justice, and the country would spend a very long time afterward paying the cost of that choice. It's worth sitting with this quietly for a moment, without rushing past it. The founding was an act of genuine courage and genuine vision. It was also, from its very first draft, entangled in a profound and unresolved injustice. Both things are true at once and neither cancels the other out. As you drift tonight, let this one land a little differently than the rest, not with a smile but with honesty. The story of the Fourth isn't only fireworks, funny footnotes, and charming historical errors. It's also this, a deleted passage, a contradiction that shaped everything that followed it. The colony that simply didn't vote let's shift, gently, back toward the stranger and lighter corners of this story, because there's a detail about the vote itself worth knowing. You probably picture all 13 colonies rising together in one unified, triumphant vote for independence. In reality, when the vote was actually taken, it wasn't a clean sweep of 13 enthusiastic yeses. It was 12 because New York's delegates, in a move of truly magnificent bureaucratic caution, simply didn't vote at all. This wasn't defiance. New York's delegates weren't opposed to independence. Their problem was procedural and oddly relatable. They hadn't yet received updated instructions from their home government, and they didn't feel authorized to commit their entire colony to an act of treason without official permission. So rather than vote yes or no, they abstained entirely. They sat quietly through the single most consequential decision in colonial history, waiting to hear back from management. New York didn't formally approve independence until July 9th, a full week later. In modern terms, this is the group chat where the plan gets made, everyone enthusiastically agrees, the event actually happens, and then one person surfaces days afterward with a simple sorry, just saw this, count me in. New York left the entire revolution on read. And honestly, there's something almost endearing about it. New York wasn't being cowardly. It was being careful, procedurally responsible, unwilling to make an enormous decision without proper authorization. In any other context, this would look like admirable diligence. It just happened to arrive in the context of founding a nation, where diligence looked a lot like showing up to the party after the cake was already gone. The larger point matters, though, because it punctures the myth of instant, total unity. The colonies weren't a single mind moving in perfect harmony. They were 13 separate, cautious, self-interested entities, each answering to its own local politics. Getting even 12 of them to agree on the same day was a minor miracle of persuasion. The 13th needed a week and a permission slip. We still have the printer who worked through the night, the bell that almost certainly never rang, the seamstress whose story may be more legend than fact, and a genuinely eerie coincidence involving two presidents dying on the same date, still ahead of us tonight. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're lying. There's no need to hold on to any of these dates or names, just let them drift through you. We're moving now from the vote itself to how the news actually reached the world. The printer who worked through the night after the text was finally approved. It didn't drift out into the world as a beautiful, handwritten document. It went to a printer named John Dunlap, who worked through the night to produce copies now known as the Dunlap broadsides. Plain, hastily set sheets of type, cranked out by candlelight, while most of Congress presumably went home to get some well-earned and deeply nervous sleep. There's something wonderful in the fact that the most explosive political document in the colonies reached the public not as a sacred, gold-leafed relic, but as a rush job from an overnight print run. No calligraphy, no ceremony, just ink on paper produced fast, because in that moment speed mattered far more than beauty. The elegant, handwritten version everyone lines up to see today came much later. The version that actually did the work of spreading the news was the humble one, made by a tired working man pulling an all-nighter. And the public didn't even hear the document read aloud in Philadelphia until July 8th, 4 full days after the date now printed on every calendar in the country. For those 4 days, the news existed mostly on paper, quietly circulating, while the formal public reveal waited for the right moment to happen. Picture the modern equivalent. A company finalizes a massive decision on a Thursday. The internal documentation is complete, but the actual public announcement, the moment everyone gathers to hear it read aloud, doesn't happen until the following Monday. In between, the news is already circulating in print while the formal unveiling waits its turn. It's a launch with a 4-day gap between the paperwork and the press conference. Once you see this gap, the tidy image of everything happening on one single, magical day quietly falls apart. The vote was on the 2nd. The text was approved on the 4th. The printing happened that same night. The public reading came on the 8th. The signatures trickled in through August. The whole event was a process stretched across weeks, not a single thunderclap of a moment. We simply chose the date printed at the top of the page and pinned the entire story to it. The bell that almost certainly never rang now for one of the most beloved images in the entire American origin story, and one of the least supported by actual evidence. You can probably picture it without even trying. The great Liberty Bell swinging triumphantly in its tower, its sound rolling out over the rooftops of Philadelphia, calling the people into the streets to learn that a nation had just been born. There is almost nothing behind that image. Historians have searched extensively for any reliable, first-hand account from 1776 describing the bell ringing specifically to mark independence, and they keep coming up empty. It isn't that anyone has proven the bell stayed silent. It's that the dramatic scene you've always imagined simply doesn't appear anywhere in the trustworthy historical record, which is a very different thing from being an established fact. There's also a practical problem. By most surviving accounts, the wooden steeple housing the bell was in fairly poor condition by that point, aged and weakened enough that enthusiastically swinging a massive bronze bell inside it might not have been the wisest structural decision anyone could make that summer. So where did this beloved scene actually come from, if not from history itself? It came from a storyteller. Decades after the events of 1776, a writer crafted a vivid tale of the bell ringing out for freedom, and it was so satisfying, so perfectly shaped, that people simply adopted it as truth. It filled an emotional need the plainer facts couldn't. The founding deserved a soundtrack, and a booming bell made for a far better one than the quieter, more accurate reality of printed sheets and a delayed public reading days later. The man responsible for popularizing this image was a writer named George Lippard, working in the 1840s, who published the tale as part of a collection of patriotic fiction, plainly labeled as such at the time. In his version, an old bell ringer waits anxiously in the tower while a young boy stands watch below, and when the moment finally arrives, the boy shouts up for the bell to ring and it peals out gloriously over the city. It's vivid. It's emotional. It has a child in it, which is basically cheating, and it is, in essence, a short story, but a truly satisfying invented scene has a way of outgrowing its own author. Lippard's tale was so beloved, so precisely shaped to match what people wanted the founding to feel like, that it quietly detached from its origins and floated off into the culture as though it had always been true. Teachers taught it. Families repeated it. It migrated from the fiction shelf to the history shelf without anyone checking its credentials at the border. Think about how this happens in your own life. A story gets told at family gatherings, something dramatic about a relative, a coincidence, an event. It gets a little more polished with each retelling. The details sharpen. The drama deepens. After a couple of decades, nobody can say for certain which parts actually happened, because the story has become more satisfying than the truth ever was. Lippard's bell is exactly that, scaled up to the size of an entire nation. None of this makes the bell any less meaningful today. It became a genuine, powerful symbol, just not on the day, and not in the way you were taught in school. A name borrowed from an entirely different struggle. Here's a small detail that quietly rearranges everything else. The name Liberty Bell, which feels as old and permanent as the founding itself, did not exist in 1776. Nobody called it that. For decades, it was simply known as the State House bell, a large, functional object that summoned people to gather and marked civic occasions, the way any ordinary bell might. The transformation happened in the 1830s, and it had nothing to do with the events of 1776 at all. It came from the movement to abolish slavery. Abolitionists, searching for powerful symbols for their cause, noticed a biblical inscription cast into the bell itself, about proclaiming liberty throughout the land. The phrase struck them as perfect, a ready-made emblem for the freedom they were fighting to extend to enslaved people, who the founding generation had left out entirely. It was these abolitionists who gave the bell its now famous name. They looked at that inscription and pointed directly at the searing contradiction of a nation that displayed such words while holding millions of people in bondage. The bell became a tool of moral argument. Its meaning turned toward a struggle its original owners had never intended or imagined. There's a strange and fitting justice buried in that journey. An ordinary state house bell, probably silent in 1776, given its most dramatic legend by a novelist decades later, and given its very name by people fighting for a freedom the founding generation had failed to extend. The bell we revere today is, in a real sense, as much a creation of the 19th century as it is of the 18th. The crack nobody can quite explain, and then there's the crack itself, the single most recognizable feature of the bell, the detail every child draws first. You would think, given how famous it is, that historians would agree on exactly how and when it happened. They don't. The romantic version says the bell cracked in the very moment of triumph, ringing so hard for independence that it split under the strain of its own joy. It's a lovely image. It also depends entirely on the ringing legend we just took apart. So if the bell likely didn't ring dramatically for independence in the first place, it obviously couldn't have cracked while doing so. The truer picture is messier and considerably less poetic. This particular bell had a troubled life from early on, a history of cracking that predates the Revolution entirely, and multiple recastings by local metalworkers trying to get the thing right. The famous crack most people picture likely developed sometime in the 1800s, well after the founding, and in a detail that adds real insult to injury, an attempted repair, meant to stop the crack from spreading and let the bell ring again, appears to have made the damage considerably worse rather than better. If you've ever tried to fix a small problem yourself and somehow made it larger and irreversible, you already understand this specific flavor of regret. The Liberty Bell, one of the most treasured objects in the country, appears to have suffered exactly that fate. So the bell you picture is, medically speaking, something of a mess, early cracking, multiple recastings, an uncertain 19th century injury, and a repair that may have finished the job. And somehow, that feels perfectly fitting. A cracked, repeatedly broken, endlessly mythologized object stands today as one of the great symbols of a nation whose own founding story is itself cracked, repeatedly revised, and just as endlessly mythologized. We still have the seamstress whose famous story may be mostly legend, the flag that had no official design at all, the anthem that belongs to an entirely different war, and that genuinely eerie coincidence involving two founding presidents, still waiting for us tonight. Let your eyelids stay heavy. There's nowhere you need to be but here, listening. We're leaving the bell tower now and heading toward a small Philadelphia parlor and a story that may be more family legend than fact. The seamstress and the story that arrived a century late. You've almost certainly heard some version of this one. A modest Philadelphia seamstress, working quietly at her needle, receives a visit from George Washington himself. He asks her to sew the very first flag of the new nation. She suggests a few improvements to the design. She stitches together the stars and stripes in her own parlor, and in doing so, quietly gives birth to one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. It's a warm story. It's domestic, humble, and deeply satisfying, and it rests on almost no solid evidence at all. When historians go looking for contemporary documentation, anything from the time confirming that Washington commissioned this woman, or that she sewed that first flag, they find a striking absence. Not proof that it didn't happen, but an unsettling silence where solid evidence should be. The timing of the story is the real giveaway. It didn't surface during the Revolution, and it didn't surface in the decades immediately afterward, when people who had actually lived through those events were still alive to confirm or deny it. It burst into public awareness in 1870. Nearly a full century after the events it describes. For 100 years, this beloved tale of the first flag simply wasn't part of the national conversation, which is a remarkably long silence for such a charming and supposedly important story. And the source of the story, when it finally appeared, was her own grandson, standing before a historical society and recounting a cherished family tale. There's nothing dishonest in a grandson sharing a story he loves about his grandmother. But as a foundation for national history, it carries some obvious weaknesses. A family legend, passed down for generations, presented by a descendant with every loving reason in the world to believe and promote it. None of this means the woman at the center of the story wasn't real. She was. She genuinely worked as a flag maker in Philadelphia. The real question is only whether that one specific, iconic scene, the visit, the parlor, the first flag, happened exactly the way the legend describes. And the honest answer, sitting here in the dark together, is that we simply don't have the evidence to know for certain either way. Think about how your own family stories work. There's probably a tale about some ancestor that gets repeated at gatherings with total, unwavering confidence. It might be entirely true. It might be embellished here and there. It might be mostly invented by someone 2 generations back who simply told it well, and it stuck. And once a story is folded into the family's shared memory, questioning it starts to feel almost rude. Now imagine that story slipping out of the family entirely and becoming a piece of national history. That most likely is what happened here. A flag with no official design at all. Here's another gentle surprise. In the earliest days of the new country, there was no single official design for the flag at all. The general guidance of the time called for stars and stripes to represent the states and their union, but it didn't specify how those stars should actually be arranged. There was no diagram, no approved template, no committee dictating exact positions. This left an enormous amount of room for whoever was actually sewing a flag to make their own decisions, and different makers made very different choices. Some arranged the stars in a neat circle. Others placed them in tidy rows. Still others clustered them into whatever pattern seemed pleasing at the time. Each flag, in its own small way, was a personal act of design. There was no wrong answer, because there was no official answer yet to measure it against. Picture the modern equivalent. A company announces a new logo, but only describes it in the vaguest possible terms, something like, "It should include a circle in our company colors," and then leaves everyone to interpret that however they like. Within weeks, you'd have 100 different versions circulating, each technically correct, none of them quite matching. That's essentially how the early American flag existed. One loose, shared idea, brought to life 100 different ways by 100 different hands. The crisp, uniform banner you know today, the one with its exact, regulated arrangement of stars, came much later, through a slow process of standardization. That neatness is real. It just isn't original. It was layered on top of something that began as a far messier, more personal, and honestly more charming tradition, one where a little piece of the maker lived inside every early flag that was stitched. Fireworks, the one tradition that actually holds up after all these gentle corrections. It's a relief to land on something that mostly survives close inspection. Fireworks, those illuminations John Adams wrote about in his letter to Abigail, were entirely real, and the very first organized 4th of July celebration, complete with actual fireworks, took place in 1777, one full year after the events being commemorated. So the founders didn't celebrate independence by lighting up the sky in 1776 itself. That night was too raw, too uncertain, too heavy with the fresh weight of treason to justify a celebratory light show. The exploding came later, once a full year of distance had passed, once the fragile new nation had actually held together long enough to be worth commemorating. The tradition of blowing up the sky for independence began not on the day itself, but on its very first birthday. There's something wonderfully human in waiting a full year to throw the party. And when you say the tradition out loud, it's genuinely strange in the best way to honor the anniversary of a written legal document. A nation apparently decided that the ideal method of tribute would be loud, colorful, faintly dangerous explosions launched into the night sky. Not a moment of solemn silence. Explosions. The modern version of this needs no imagination at all, because you live it every year. A responsible adult drives to a temporary tent in a parking lot, buys a quantity of genuine explosives from a stranger, brings them home, and sets them off in the driveway in tribute to a document approved in 1776. And this is considered not just normal but deeply patriotic. Adams predicted it. He simply couldn't have predicted the parking lot tent. An unpaid holiday for most of its life, you might assume the 4th was treated as sacred from the very beginning, an official, government-recognized day of national reverence from the moment the ink dried on the Declaration. It wasn't. For a remarkably long stretch of the country's life, the day was celebrated unevenly. It was a strong local tradition in many towns, practically ignored in others, kept alive by popular affection rather than any government decree. Congress did not designate the 4th of July as an official federal holiday until 1870, nearly a century after the events themselves. And even after that, it wasn't a paid holiday for federal workers until 1938. Do the arithmetic on that for a moment. For well over a century after independence, and for decades even after the holiday became official, celebrating the birth of the nation was something Americans did entirely on their own time, without compensation, purely out of affection for the day itself. The idea that a national holiday should come with a paid day off, something we now take completely for granted, is a surprisingly modern invention, arriving deep into the 20th century, long after the founders and their children and their grandchildren had all passed on. There's something almost sweeter in that if you sit with it. The 4th endured not because a government insisted on it, but because ordinary people genuinely wanted to keep celebrating it, year after year, on their own dime. The affection came first. The official recognition trailed far, far behind it, rowdier than you'd guess in those early, unofficial years, The way people actually celebrated looked nothing at all like the calm, gentle picnic you might be picturing right now. Early 4th of July gatherings were loud, boisterous affairs, built around long sequences of political toasts. To liberty, to the states, to the militia, to any general or abstract virtue that came to mind, with a fresh drink accompanying each one. Cannons were fired as part of the festivities. Speeches ran long, delivered to crowds growing steadily less capable of following complicated arguments as the toasting wore on. It was, in short, less a wholesome family cookout and more a very patriotic, artillery-punctuated evening of communal drinking. And somehow, that feels more honest than the picnic version. A brand new country, improbably still standing, marking its own survival with loud, joyful, slightly reckless abandon. Still ahead tonight, an anthem that belongs to an entirely different war, a fighting that started before independence was even declared, and the strange, genuinely eerie coincidence of two presidents dying on the very same date. Let your breathing settle into something slow and even. We're moving now into the part of the story where dates start to blur together in ways that quietly rearrange your entire sense of the timeline. An anthem born from an entirely different war. Here's one that tends to catch people off guard. The Star-Spangled Banner, the anthem strained through at every ball game, every ceremony, every solemn occasion, has nothing whatsoever to do with the Revolution or with the 4th of July. It was written decades later, during the War of 1812, a completely separate conflict fought against Britain long after independence had already been won and recognized. The song was inspired by a specific event in that later war, a long night of bombardment, after which the sight of a flag still flying moved a witness to put the moment into words. To the men who declared independence in 1776, the events that would eventually inspire this anthem hadn't happened yet. They wouldn't have thought of them as history at all. They would have been recent news, current events, decades still to come. And the anthem's official status is even more recent than its origin. It wasn't formally adopted as the national anthem until 1931, more than a century after the war that inspired it, and more than a century and a half after independence itself. The song you treat as timeless and foundational is, in official terms, a fairly modern designation. Once you absorb this, the whole patriotic bundle starts to look different. The Declaration from 1776, the bell's dramatic legend from the 1840s, the bell's actual name from the 1830s, the anthem's origin from the 1810s, made official in the 1930s. It isn't a single snapshot from one glorious summer. It's a collage, assembled slowly across more than a century and a half, from entirely different chapters of the country's life. The shot fired before the Declaration existed, and here's a detail that quietly flips the order of events you probably learned as children. You likely picture it this way. The colonists declare independence and then, provoked into action, take up arms and go to war for it. Declaration first, fighting second. Cause, then effect. It happened the other way around. The famous phrase about the shot heard round the world refers to the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which took place in 1775, more than a full year before independence was ever formally declared. The war, in other words, was already well underway before anyone approved a single word of the Declaration. By the time the founders finally sat down to formally declare independence, blood had already been spilled. Men had already died. The war wasn't some future consequence waiting to be triggered by the document. It was an ongoing, present reality that had been unfolding for over a year already. The Declaration didn't start the fighting. It was a formal statement, issued in the middle of a conflict that was already burning, explaining to the world and to the colonists themselves exactly what all of it had been for. There's a useful modern parallel here. Imagine two parties already locked in a long, damaging dispute, one that has already caused real harm and shows no sign of stopping. Well into that conflict, one side finally issues a formal written statement announcing that the relationship is over. The statement feels like the dramatic turning point. In truth, it's simply putting into official language something everyone involved already knew, because they'd been fighting about it for over a year. The Declaration gave the war a purpose, a stated cause, a philosophical foundation, a reason to keep going. That mattered enormously, but it didn't fire the first shot. The first shot had already been fired, and its echo was still hanging in the summer air when the founders finally picked up their pens. Declaring it wasn't the same as winning it, and this leads to something the fireworks tend to blur completely. Declaring independence and actually achieving it were two very different things, separated by years of brutal, uncertain war. The 4th of July celebrates the announcement, the statement of intent. It doesn't celebrate a victory, because in 1776 there was no victory yet to celebrate. There was only a bold, dangerous claim made by men with absolutely no guarantee it would ever come true. The war dragged on for years after the Declaration was signed, through hardship, defeat, and stretches so dark that the entire cause looked doomed. Independence wasn't formally recognized by Britain until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, 7 full years after the date you celebrate every summer. 7 years of grinding war stood between the announcement and its actual, official realization. So the 4th isn't really the finish line. It's closer to the starting gun, the moment a group of exhausted, frightened, determined men committed themselves to a race whose length and outcome they couldn't possibly have known in advance. Celebrating independence on the 4th of July is a little like celebrating a marathon at the sound of the starting pistol, before a single mile has actually been run. The hard part, the years of grueling effort that came after, is what nobody puts on the poster. If anything, this makes the courage of that original moment greater, not smaller. These men declared independence knowing full well the fight was far from over, knowing the odds were long, knowing the cost could be everything they had. They fired the starting gun with no promise at all of a finish. A country nowhere near united, and the tidy image of a nation standing shoulder to shoulder behind that declaration doesn't hold up well either. A significant share of colonists remained loyal to the British Crown throughout the war. Many others wanted no part of the conflict at all. They simply hoped to keep their heads down, protect their families, and survive whatever was coming. This wasn't an abstract disagreement conducted at a comfortable distance. It split families down the middle. It turned lifelong neighbors into enemies. Choosing a side or refusing to choose one at all could cost a person their home, their safety, or their life. In many places, the war carried the intimate cruelty of a civil war, communities tearing quietly apart from the inside. So, for a great many people actually living through that summer, the 4th wasn't a joyous, unified celebration. It was a source of genuine dread and danger. Understanding this makes what was eventually achieved more remarkable, not less. Independence was won not by a perfectly unified people, but by a passionate, determined faction that prevailed despite deep internal division and widespread reluctance. The unity came later, built slowly over generations. It wasn't present at the very beginning. 2 founders, one impossible date now, something genuinely eerie. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the man who wrote the Declaration and the man who fiercely championed it, both died on July 4, 1826. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration to the day, within hours of each other. Let the precision of that settle for a moment. Not just the same year. The exact 50th anniversary down to the date. Both men, elderly and failing, held on through that spring and into that summer, and both let go on the very anniversary of the document that had defined their entire lives. Their relationship had spanned an extraordinary arc, allies in the fight for independence, then bitter political rivals who wounded each other deeply, and finally, in their last years, reconciled friends who exchanged long, thoughtful letters across the distance between them. And then they died together, in a sense, on the same symbolically loaded day. There's a detail that makes it even more haunting. In his final hours, Adams is said to have taken comfort in the belief that Jefferson still lived, that his old friend and rival carried on. He spoke of Jefferson near the end, unaware that Jefferson had already died hours earlier that same day. Historians offer rational explanations, of course. Both men were elderly and gravely ill, and there's some evidence that anniversaries can affect the timing of a person's final days in ways not fully understood. But even with every reasonable caveat in place, the sheer precision of it, the same day, the same 50th anniversary, the two of them, remains genuinely remarkable. And the pattern didn't stop there. James Monroe, another president from the founding generation, also died on July 4th, this time in 1831. Three of the first five American presidents died on the exact same date. And on the other side of it, Calvin Coolidge, a future president, was born on the 4th of July. The date doesn't only take. Apparently, it also gives. We're nearing the end of tonight's unraveling. Still ahead, the turkey that Franklin never actually campaigned for, the building that didn't have its famous name yet, and the quiet, reflective close to everything we've uncovered tonight. Almost there now. Let your body feel heavy against whatever is holding you up. This is the last stretch of tonight's journey, and it ends somewhere soft. The parchment that arrived after the fact before we get to the turkey. One more quiet correction about that beautiful document itself. The elegant, handwritten parchment you picture, the one preserved behind reinforced glass, gazed at reverently by lines of visitors, was not the version actually approved on the 4th. That gorgeous, carefully lettered copy was prepared afterward and signed gradually over the following weeks and months, the same way we described earlier. What Congress actually adopted on the 4th was simply the wording, approved as final, then rushed to a printer that same night. So the sacred object everyone lines up to see is, in a sense, the deluxe edition, a beautiful ceremonial version produced once the real, consequential decision had already been made through humbler, plainer means. The working copy did the actual job. The elegant one came later, purely to mark the occasion. And yet it's the elegant one we've chosen to enshrine, simply because it looks the way a sacred founding document ought to look. Beauty wins out over chronology, once again, in the story we've chosen to carry forward. The turkey Franklin never actually fought for. You've probably heard this one told with a laugh at some point. Benjamin Franklin supposedly campaigned to make the turkey America's national bird instead of the bald eagle. It's a delightful image, Franklin standing before his peers, earnestly championing the turkey while everyone rolls their eyes. It's also considerably exaggerated. Franklin never formally proposed the turkey for anything. He didn't stand up in any official setting and argue for it. There was no turkey campaign, no lobbying effort, no earnest proposal voted down by eagle enthusiasts. What actually happened was much smaller and far more personal. In a private letter to his daughter, Franklin simply grumbled that the bald eagle had, in his opinion, a poor moral character, the sort of bird that survives by taking from others, and remarked, somewhat wryly, that the turkey struck him as a more respectable, more genuinely native bird. It was a witty, opinionated aside in a family letter, not a policy position, not a crusade. You can see exactly how the legend grew, because it's the same engine that inflated the bell and the seamstress into national mythology. A small, real, charming detail gets discovered, and because it's fun, it gets repeated. With each retelling it grows a little, sharpens a little, until a modest private grumble about a bird becomes a full-blown founding campaign that never actually took place. The good story quietly eats the boring truth, the way it almost always does. The building that didn't have its name yet, and finally, the building itself, the place now reverently known as Independence Hall, treated as sacred ground, the very cradle of the nation. In 1776, it didn't have that name at all. It was simply the Pennsylvania State House, a plain, functional government building where officials met to conduct the ordinary business of governing. No soaring title, no reverence. Just an office in every practical sense, where men argued fiercely over wording, sweated through the Philadelphia heat, and swatted at flies drifting in through open windows. The grand name arrived much later, bestowed once the events that happened inside had been polished by time and memory into legend. As the founding itself grew sacred in the national imagination, the building was elevated right along with it, renamed to reflect the weight of what had occurred within its walls. It's a fitting note to end our corrections on, because it captures the entire pattern of tonight's journey in a single detail. Nearly everything about the 4th of July that feels grand, permanent, and sacred was actually shaped, named, or polished well after the fact. The bell got its legend from a novelist and its name from abolitionists decades later. The parchment came after the real decision. The anthem came from a different war entirely. And even the building got its majestic name only once ordinary rooms had been transformed, retroactively, into hallowed ground. Why we still celebrate it anyway so, after all of this, the wrong date, the delayed signing, the bell that probably never rang, the seamstress whose story may be more legend than fact, the war that started before the words did, the 7 years still ahead after the ink dried, you might reasonably ask why we bother celebrating the 4th at all. The answer is quietly simple. The date printed at the top of the Declaration reads July 4th, 1776. That's what people saw. That's what got printed, circulated, and remembered. The vote on the 2nd. The signing spread across August, the reading on the 8th, all of it faded with time, while the date on the page endured because that's the date the story chose to attach itself to. There's something worth sitting within that, as your eyes finally close all the way. History is so often less about the precise mechanics of what happened, and more about the story a people choose to carry forward together. The exact sequence of votes and signatures matters to historians, and it should. But what shapes a nation is the shared memory, the date everyone quietly agrees to gather around year after year. Even the myth served a purpose. The ringing bell, the seamstress in her parlor, the founders signing together in one golden, unified moment, these aren't really lies so much as emotional truths a people wrapped gently around the drier facts to make the story feel the way it needed to feel. A nation doesn't drift off to sleep on a list of corrected dates. It falls asleep to a story. And a good story needs a bell, a flag, a single shared moment of courage. None of tonight's corrections actually make the founding smaller. If anything, they make it larger. The real version, messier, slower, deeply divided, riddled with contradiction, achingly human, is more remarkable than the clean myth ever was. Real men, exhausted and afraid, argued for weeks in a sweltering state house and committed treason not in one heroic flash, but slowly, deliberately, uncertain the whole time whether they would end up free or hanged. That is more impressive than the poster version, not less. So we celebrate the 4th because it's the day the idea took hold, the date the story quietly settled on, the anniversary a people chose, generation after generation, to carry forward. It doesn't matter that the vote came on the 2nd or the reading on the 8th. What matters is that a nation once looked at a piece of paper, saw a date, and decided that this would be the day it remembered itself into being. That is worth carrying. Flawed, tangled, half-invented, and gloriously human as it is, the story was worth keeping. Underneath every myth we gently took apart tonight sits something genuinely true. A group of imperfect people, in an imperfect building on a not-quite accurate date, set down an idea powerful enough to outgrow their own failures, and it became a standard the world is still, slowly, reaching toward. The facts are messy. The idea endures, and that quietly is more than enough reason to let the sky light up one more summer, so there it is. The 4th of July, gently unwrapped and turned over in the dark, the wrong date, the bell that probably never rang, the flag whose maker we can't quite confirm, the document most people signed weeks after the fact. We spent tonight pulling threads, and the neat little tapestry from your childhood classroom came apart in our hands. And somehow, none of it feels smaller for the unraveling. Behind every myth we set down tonight stood real people, tired, sweating men in a stuffy state house, arguing over commas, committing an act of treason not in one heroic flash but slowly, over long and frightening weeks. A writer sitting quietly wounded while his best lines were crossed out. A printer working through the night so a nation could read the news by morning. A country capable of writing words more beautiful than it was able to live up to, and then spending generations trying to grow into them. That's the quiet miracle underneath all of it. History is rarely as clean as the poster on the wall. It's messy, contradictory, half-remembered, stitched together from whatever stories we chose to keep. But the choosing is its own kind of truth. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow in your cool, quiet room, lights dimmed, fan humming softly somewhere nearby, maybe let go of needing the story to be perfect. The people who lived it certainly couldn't. They simply did the best they could with the day they were given and passed it forward quietly to you. Rest easy now. The sky can keep its fireworks until morning.